wanted to ask if there's, I know there is some wrestlers in the room. One of our elders actually, I know used to be a wrestler himself. Now I think he's relegated to the church softball team now, so. But I see the Neil boys back here. They're wrestlers. Yeah, we've got some of the Lemons. Yeah, I know that. Yeah, Matt, Paige here, we got lots of wrestlers, right? So as wrestlers, though, there's a few things that we know about wrestling. Wrestling is a contact sport, right? You have to be engaged. You have to be engaged with someone you're wrestling. It's not a sport where you're, avoiding any contact, but it requires resistance, it requires struggling. Oftentimes it requires pain as we wrestle with whoever we're wrestling with. See, there was a time in my life that I was wrestling with God. Not in a physical sense, but in a figurative sense. Anyone here ever wrestled with God? Yeah. See, many of you know a little bit about some of the background, my vocational background, but I know that there's many in here that do not. But there was a point in my life that I was really wrestling with God. And after college, I had connected with a friend of mine, a childhood friend. I knew him from the time he was, in diapers. We were neighbors, and so we were good friends throughout school, went to the same high school, went to different colleges, but after college we reconnected. And he had a family-owned business. And he was starting a new venture, though. It was related to his business, but he wanted to start a new business, and he wanted me to come and run this business. And so it seemed like a good fit. It was a good idea, and I went and I worked for him. I built this company up from the ground floor, with the help, obviously, of many employees, and we grew, we were successful. I'd invested over 6 years of my life into this company. But there came a day when you could say we didn't see eye to eye any longer. We think of marriages, why they end today. Now people will mark on their divorce forms what irreconcilable difference is. A husband and a spouse, they don't see eye to eye anymore. They have irreconcilable differences, and this is a reason they use for divorce. Well, we know in the workplace this could often be a reason why someone leaves, someone goes, and this is what happened there. And about at this time, though, the Lord was putting something in my heart. He was putting a passion, a desire to build into His kingdom. He put this within my heart. And it was interesting because we had just come to Valparaiso at that time. We'd probably been there a couple years in Valparaiso, and we met someone, a real good friend of Julie's actually, she's still close with, but they had moved on to Canada. And through this relationship, I got connected with some Christian businessmen in town. And these businessmen, I remember this interview distinctly, because I came into this interview, and I just shared my heart with them. I said, my desire, my purpose, what God has put within my heart is to build into His kingdom. And to build what He, I thought, blessed me with talents, gifts, abilities in the business, in the workplace. I had a background, I had a degree from Purdue, business. I wanted to use that for His glory, for His kingdom. And I remember seeing them, there was a couple of them in the room, and they just looked at each other and pretty much said, "You're hired," because this was their mission, this was their purpose, was to build into God's kingdom, to use the talents, the resources that they had been given by God to further His kingdom. And so I flourished there for a while, and through this relationship I actually ended up connecting with someone else. And so I kind of left this group, but by the way, this group continues today, and their resources, their efforts in the past have resulted in the formation of the New Creation Center. We have a men's homeless center that we do here at our church. And through their efforts, through their resources, they have brought about the New Creation Center. They've brought that idea forth and also just to support it with their resources. But through this relationship, I connected with someone else. And if any of you know my interests, my background, I love basketball. And so when this opportunity came forth, it was through another relationship, and it was to run and to manage a basketball facility in town here. And it was a brand new venture as well. And it felt like, God, you're opening this door. It was a perfect fit, right? But almost suddenly, after this opened, it was within months of the place opening, the plan just basically disintegrated. Basically, God closed that door, and it was evident that this wasn't going to work. And this was the point I was struggling. I'd struggled with men in the past. I'd run away, perhaps, from some issues. But now I began to struggle with God. What He seemed to be opening, what He seemed to be bringing forth, all of a sudden was gone. And I was struggling with God. There's a man in Genesis 32 by the name of Jacob. And he was also wrestling with God. And not just in the figurative sense that we're talking about here, right? But it says literally that Jacob wrestled with God. Face to face, he came to God. See, Jacob's life, he also had been doing some running. He had struggled with Laban. Laban was his father-in-law. He had wanted to marry Rachel, right? So Rachel was going to be his wife. But Laban came to him and said, Jacob, you're going to have to work for me for 7 years. So Jacob went along with this. He worked for 7 years. He really loved Rachel. And then what happens? At the end of that 7 years, Laban comes to him and says, this really isn't our tradition. This isn't our custom to give the older daughter or the younger daughter in marriage, but rather to give the younger daughter. And so he says, here's Leah. Leah will be your wife. Now, you can understand Jacob probably not too thrilled about that because he loved Rachel, right? So he convinces eventually Laban that he can marry Rachel as well, but he has to struggle. He has to work longer for Laban before he's to marry Rachel. He ends up marrying both Leah and Rachel. In this passage in Genesis 32, it says that he is preparing to meet Esau. He's also struggled with Esau in the past, right? We know the story. Jacob and Esau were twins. What happened? Esau was born first. He had the birthright. But Jacob deceived his father into giving him the birthright. He acted like he was Esau. And he got the birthright, a blessing from Isaac, his father. So here he was in Genesis 32, and he's afraid. He's praying to God. He's asking for help to be delivered. And let's read the passage starting in verse 22. It says this, That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that the hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, Let me go, for it is daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go unless you bless me. The man asked him, What is your name? Jacob, he answered. Then the man said, Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome. Jacob said, Please tell me your name. But he replied, Why do you ask me my name? Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. It says, The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. See, a couple things here I want us to pick up on. First of all, in verse 24, notice it says, Jacob was left alone. Oftentimes, we need to get alone in our life. We need to find a place of solitude so we can hear from God. Now, God can certainly come and speak to us in the busyness of our lives at any moment. But oftentimes, he comes when we set aside time, we get in a place of solitude, alone time, and he appears to us. So Jacob, it says, was left alone, and then God comes to him. Notice here what happens. Just think about that for a moment. Wrestling with God. Can we fathom that? You know, we have some wrestlers here. Would you like to face off with God on the mat? But here he is. Jacob is wrestling with God. Maybe initially he doesn't know that, but eventually he does. And see what's happening. It says here in verse 25, it says, the man saw that he could not overpower him. See, it appears that Jacob is holding his own, right? There's a stalemate. Jacob has a tremendous will. He's facing off with this man, and it appears that there's a stalemate. It reminds me of a story. We had just, again, moved to Valparaiso. And my oldest daughter, Ari, she's sitting up here today. She's going to be 12 this month, right? But she was probably no more than 2 years old, probably about 2 years old. And on this particular day, Julie, her mother, and Ari were out shopping. And they were coming home. And in they had pulled the garage in their 2000 Chevy Impala that we used to have. And on this particular day, I think Ari felt a little strong-willed. And I think she wanted to impose her will on her mother. And so Julie wanted her to get out. So she comes around to the door, right, and she's face-to-face with Ari, trying to get her to come out of the car. But Ari, you know, here's Ari. I think she's probably about 3 foot tall, you know, maybe no more than 30 pounds, right? But I think she thinks she's 7 foot tall here. And so she tells her mom, no, you know, I'm not coming out of the car. And what happens? Slap. Ari slaps Julie across the face. Now you can imagine that her mom was quite stunned with this. Here's her precious little Ari, right? Precious little Ari, and this slap comes across her face. So Julie now, she's in a very disciplined manner, very constructive. She understands that she needs to, this is unacceptable behavior, right? Okay, she needs to discipline her child here. And she decides that she needs to let her know how this feels. So Julie, again, in a very constructive manner, slaps Ari. Right? So now this, you can imagine Ari, her face turns bright red. Her eyes get bugged out. She looks at her mom, you can't do that to me. What are you doing? Right? What does she do? Slaps mom back, right? Slaps mom back. Now, I think this goes on for a couple more rounds. But right about at this time, our neighbors walk by. Right? Walking by on the sidewalk. Now, it's a good thing our neighbors knew us well enough at that point. So, everything was good. But, see, I think a few things happened there. Because eventually, Ari comes in, right? But I think reality begins to hit Ari. See, I think first of all, she realizes that this isn't a battle she's going to win, right? She sees her mom much taller, much stronger than her. She's totally dependent on her mom, right? Not only does she realize how stronger she is, but she knows her mother to be loving, to be caring. She bathes her, she feeds her, she clothes her, and she realizes that she is totally dependent on her. She probably couldn't even get out of the car without her mom helping unbuckle the seat, right? You know, at that age. So I think that reality begins to sink in. And I think also, I know Ari, see, she gets hungry after she's gone shopping and after she's been gone a while. And so she probably walks into the house here and she wants a snack. So, and she's dependent on her mom because that snack is up in the top shelf of the pantry, right? She can't reach up that far. So knowing Ari, she probably surrenders, gives to her mom, and gets that snack inside, right? Well, see, I think Jacob also is enlightened here as he is wrestling with God. And he comes to a great realization in this passage. See, it appears that he is struggling and he is holding his own here. But I think Jacob comes to the realization that God is much stronger, much greater than him. What does it say here? It says that God touches Jacob's hip and the hip is wrenched. Now, I don't know, I'm not a wrestler, but if I've been wrestling all night, that's what it says here. It says Jacob wrestled with this man till daybreak. And my hip gets wrenched. That's probably not a pleasant thing. Because I'm already worn out, I'm tired, and my hip is wrenched. I'm going to probably want to give up and surrender. See, in God, it says, touches Jacob's hip, and his hip is wrenched. But you see here, when Jacob engages God, when he comes to this place of engaging God and wrestling with God, it takes him to a good place. It takes him to a place where all he can do is surrender to God. You see, all he can do is surrender to him and hold on to him. See, just before God comes to wrestle with Jacob in this chapter, it says in verse 12 this, it says, "But you have said, I will surely make you prosper, and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted." See, Jacob is praying to God for deliverance from his brother Esau. He's afraid of Esau and what he can do to him. But Jacob is clinging to the promises of God. See, God has promised him that he will bring forth a great nation through him. And he is holding on to that promise. And he says this, he says, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Now, Jacob in the past, he could be sneaky. He could be clever. Oftentimes, he would dictate to God the terms, right? I mean, we look back at the story of Esau and how he deceived. He didn't totally trust God. But see, in this passage, I think we have a new Jacob. Because look at Hosea 12. You don't have to turn there, but Hosea 12, verses 3 and 4 says this. I'll read it. Talking about Jacob, it says, "He took his brother by the heel in the womb, and in his strength he struggled with God. Yes, he struggled with the angel, and he prevailed. He wept and sought favor from him." You see, Jacob was weeping as he was holding on to God here. All he could do, he knew he was defeated. He was broken. All he could do was surrender to God and hold on to him and ask for a touch, ask for a blessing. He can't fight anymore. This isn't a bad place to be, friends. See, and God is answering Jacob's prayer in the midst of this. Again, remember, Jacob here is asking for deliverance from Esau. See, Jacob thought that the real enemy in this passage was Esau, right? He thought Esau was his real enemy. But the reality is, the real enemy was his own flesh, his carnal nature. God had to defeat his old nature here before he could deliver him from Esau. See, I mentioned earlier the time that I was struggling with God. And this was a time where I became broken. I remember distinctly the year, the season it was Thanksgiving of 2006. It was just after this opportunity I mentioned earlier had been shut. Julie knows this was a tough time, and she struggled as well. But it was at this time where I really wrestled with God. It appeared that God was working these things. I mean, it appeared, if you could just see, the opportunities, it seemed like God was laying out before us. He was lining these things up, and then boom, it just shuts. And you just don't understand what he's doing. And a lot of you don't know this too, but at that particular time, see, I still needed to, I felt like I needed to make something happen. I needed to propel myself with my self-will, self-reliance, and to make something happen. And at this time, many of you don't know this, but our former pastor, Dan Von Traeger, and we were one step away from opening up a Christian bookstore in town. We had met with Lemstone Christian Bookstores. They're out of Chicago, actually a suburb in Wheaton, Illinois. They had approved our franchise. We had picked our location. We were going to be over here where Penny's is. If you guys know where that is. And let me tell you, that location too was going to be full of retailers. I mean, when we saw the layout there, it was Dick's Sporting Goods, Circuit City. There was going to be multiple restaurants, banks. I mean, the things they had letters of intent from some of these. They had, people coming into this. It was exciting. And we were one step away from opening that bookstore. But I remember we fasted, we were praying, and we asked God just to reveal his will in this, to open or close the doors as he decides, as he purposes. And right along that time, all of a sudden the door closed. We got a call from the Lemstone franchise, and they had just gotten bought out by Parable Bookstores, and they're out of California, a little larger bookstore chain. And it was evident that things were going to change. They still wanted us to go forward, but we saw that it wasn't right. Clearly God was showing us by his providence, by his will there. And so we didn't open the store. You see, God had a different plan. There was a verse that Jesus said as he started out the Sermon on the Mount. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." We think about the kingdoms of this world, how they've come about by will, by determination, by power, by conquering. See, that's what I thought I needed to do. I needed to take this. I needed to make something happen. But see, I came to the point at this time when I was broken. God closed this door again, where all I could do was hang on to him. I couldn't understand what he was doing. I realized that I could not do anything of eternal value in my own efforts. I could not. I had to surrender completely to him. And see, in this verse, Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." See, he says something quite different. The Greek word here for poor means helpless, powerless to accomplish an end, poor, or needy. See, it's when we come to the end of ourselves, realizing our tremendous need for him, That's a life-changing moment. That's a life-changing moment, friends. For Jacob, it wasn't just a life-changing moment. It was a name-changing moment, right? He says in this passage, no longer will your name be Jacob, but your name will be Israel. Israel means God prevails. See, when God touches us, and we surrender to Him, and we become totally dependent on Him, that's a life-changing moment, friends. Maybe today, you're wrestling with God at this moment. Maybe you need to wrestle with God. Maybe He's speaking something to your heart right now. And you need to engage with God. Wrestle with God. Let me ask you a question. What's preventing us from walking in all that the Lord has for us today? What's preventing us? It's not God, friends. God is willing. God is able. And it's not others, right? It's not Laban. It's not Esau. It's not any other circumstance. It's not any other trial. But it's ourselves. It's ourselves.